A review of the Canadian inflation problem and the strategy for recovery by Group G8. Thesis statement. While the Bank of Canada is taking action to combat inflation through increased interest rates, the authors believe that their efforts may have fallen short and that the Bank of Canada and the Canadian government can and should have a more robust contingency plan in place to protect the Canadian economy against unexpected events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Introduction. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, is a measure of the combined price consumers pay for a fixed market basket of goods and services in a given period, relative to the combined price of an identical basket of goods and services in a base period. The Bank of Canada has a target of 2% for inflation for a healthy economy. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Canada had a CPI of 2.2% and was roughly on target. On May 1st, 2020, the CPI inflation level in Canada hit a dangerous low of negative 0.4%, but since then rose, hitting a dangerous high of 8.1% on June 1st, 2022. Inflation started off in durable goods, but eventually spread to include services as well. Research questions. Why has the CPI inflated? How is it affecting the economy? What is the Bank of Canada doing about it? What can be done to prepare for an uncertain future? Research findings. We looked at the following in order to create this report. Literature review. The causes of inflation in Canada. The impact of inflation on the economy. The relationship between unemployment and inflation. The Bank of Canada's stabilization policy. Criticism of the Bank of Canada's response to inflation, the initial expected length of the inflationary crisis, the Canadian economic forecast, and recommendations for the future. Our literature review included the following key literature sources to base our paper. Macklem states the Bank of Canada's reasoning for Canada's inflation. Shen and Tome provide their opinion on the causes of Canadian inflation and whether they think the bank's monetary policy will bring down inflation. Benchatrite and Wood both provide real-world examples of inflation in the Canadian economy. Farnham explains the economic concepts surrounding inflation. Gupta provides a critique of the Bank of Canada's response to inflation. IMF describes their recovery prediction for the Canadian economy and offers tools to protect the economy from future problems. The causes of inflation in Canada. First, the Canadian economy was opened and closed multiple times to stop the spread of the coronavirus. There was also spikes in demand for durable goods, which strained global supply chains. Bottlenecks resulted in a supply chain shortage, with long delays for goods, and led to inflated prices for many goods traded internationally. Lastly, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine in February 2022. The impact of inflation on the economy. Post-pandemic, there was an increased demand for services. Services especially in demand were in the travel, recreation, and food services sectors. This rapid rise in service pricing contributed to the total CPI inflation, reaching its apex at 8.1% in June 2022. Two key examples of the impact of inflation on the economy. Firstly, there was Camp Bob, which is a kids' summer camp in Campbell River, BC. They typically raise their camp prices by $5 to $10 a year to keep up with rising costs. However, in 2022, they had to raise their camp prices $35 to keep up with the cost of inflation. Secondly, there's the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index indicates that car rental prices have increased 48% from July 2019 to July 2022.
The relationship between unemployment and inflation. Farnham states that one of the most important goals of policymakers is to ensure that the economy is as close to full employment as possible without setting off a period of inflation as output and employment move close to the capacity of the economy. Here we can see there is an inverse relationship between the CPI and the unemployment to job vacancy ratio in Canada starting in 2021. If the interest rate hikes reduce job openings, as Chen and Tome describe, then perhaps the relationship between the CPI and the unemployment to job vacancy ratio will be an indicator of decreasing inflation. The Bank of Canada's stabilization policy. Malcolm describes how, in response to the inflation in the Canadian economy, the Bank of Canada raised interest rates in 5 steps since March 2022, increasing the overnight policy rate in one of the steepest and fastest tightening cycles we've ever conducted. Here we can see how the Bank of Canada has aggressively raised interest rates from 0.25% in January of 2022 to 3.75% in October of 2022. The bank focuses on 3 more statistical measures of core inflation. The CPI medium and the CPI trim exclude whatever is volatile at the time. The CPI common is based on a statistical technique that captures the common component in the price changes across many goods and services, capturing the idea that inflation reflects a general increase in prices. The 3 metrics provide strength in diversity. The Bank of Canada states that some interest rate sensitive business sectors have responded, such as the previously overheated housing market, as new debt is more expensive. However, the Bank of Canada does state that it takes longer for monetary policy to bring down price growth in other goods and services, especially services, because they aren't tied directly to borrowing. The bank ensures that the higher interest rates should bring down the price growth over time as the total spending in the economy moderates. Criticism of the Bank of Canada's response to inflation. Chen and Tome state that the monetary policy is not going to positively affect Canada's labour shortage. However, the Bank of Canada's monetary policy can help to lower total aggregate demand, reducing the pressure on businesses to expand, which will reduce job openings and slow the economy down, which should help inflation to lessen. Lower aggregate demand will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, as illustrated by Farnham. One key criticism is that the Bank of Canada was drastically understating inflation through their CPI measure, and if calculated more accurately, inflation had really been approximately 3%, significantly above the 2% target, for over 8 months before the Bank of Canada began raising their interest rates in March 2022. Another key criticism is that the Canadian federal government has been spending at a historic rate, as can be seen in this chart, and that this spending has been adding fuel to the inflation fire. The initial expected length of the inflationary crisis. Malcolm outlines the Bank of Canada's forecast for the inflationary problems. During the initial price increases, the Bank of Canada thought that the trade shortages, logistical backlogs, and input shortages would only be transitory. However, inflation kept rising because of a black swan event, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Chen and Tome also describe how many economic analysts consider oil price shocks and supply chain bottlenecks transitory, in the sense that their causes are not long-term structural shifts and they could dissipate quickly. However, labor costs in Canada have been rising, and Chen and Tome state that if labor costs keep rising, a wage price spiral may be created that would increase expectations and lead to yet more inflation. Malcolm and the Bank of Canada also acknowledged that if the current inflation raises wages, the rising cost of labor could make goods and services even more expensive, pushing inflation up even further in an unfortunate self-fulfilling way. The longer inflation stays higher than the optimal 2% target, the greater the risk that high inflation becomes entrenched, which will need to be contained with an even more drastic stabilization policy. The Canadian Economic Forecast. As seen in this chart, the IMF forecasts that the Canadian inflation will get back to the 2% target in approximately 2024. If inflation does not come down, the Bank of Canada may have to hike the basis rates even more, which could trigger a mild recession. The IMF recommends that the BOC continue hiking the policy rate to at least 4% by end of year and remain around that level for several quarters in order to put inflation decisively on a downward path while achieving the soft landing. Recommendations. As mentioned before by the IMF and Farnham, the Canadian economy has to adjust for several years to bring inflation down. The original 2 to 3 year hypothesis prediction may be correct. If not proven correct, currently it seems at least reasonable. However, the bank and academics initially thought that the inflation problem would be transitory, yet the unexpected Russian invasion of Ukraine pushed inflation even higher. It is the author's opinion that there is the possibility of another unexpected event that could raise inflation just as the Russia-Ukraine war did. An unexpected event with a possibility to occur that would affect global inflation is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Actually, Rhodes states that Taiwan is currently preparing to be invaded. Blanche and DePippo for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service state that a conflict over Taiwan would devastate the global economy, resulting in widespread financial losses. Probable impacts of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan are collapsed commercial shipping routes and ports throughout the war zone, seizing supply chains, and financial market fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Therefore, in the case of another unexpected event, Georgieva for the IMF states that central banks need to act decisively, keeping their finger on the pulse of the economy and adjust policy appropriately. The other thing that Georgieva recommends for developed countries is to adjust rising debt. As Gupta states, the Canadian government's choice to increase spending has added to the problem of inflation. Georgieva describes that spending must be carefully prioritized on safety nets, health, and education, and targeted to the most vulnerable. Planning to include a credible medium-term fiscal path, including equitable tax policies, is a strategy that will not compromise public debt sustainability, aiding economic health. Conclusion. Initially, inflation was thought to be only transitory, but the unexpected Russian invasion of Ukraine created global economic problems, such as a rise in energy cost. Therefore, it is the author's opinion that the Canadian government needs to prepare as best as they can for unexpected inflation-causing events. Georgieva states that central banks should closely watch their economic indicators and act decisively when needed. Second, governments need to address rising debt by prioritizing safety nets, health, and education spending, and should use a credible medium-term fiscal path, including equitable tax policies to foster a healthy economy.